The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the thin wool of her tunic, settled deep in her bones, and made the flagstones of the great hall a perpetual torment against the soles of her worn-out slippers. Ilara knelt, her knuckles raw and red, scrubbing at a stain that refused to yield. It was wine, dark as old blood, spilled the night before by a laughing lord who had looked right through her as if she were made of glass. They all looked through her. She was Ilara, the Omega orphan, the nameless shadow that scurried along the walls, emptying chamber pots and polishing silver that would never reflect her own face. To be invisible was to be safe. That was the first lesson she had ever learned. The second was that safety was a lie. A sharp kick connected with her ribs. The bucket of murky water sloshed, spilling icy streams over her legs. She gasped, curling into herself as pain, bright and sharp, lanced through her side. "Useless thing," Lyra sneered, standing over her. Lyra was the daughter of the Pax Beta, all glossy black hair and cruel, pretty smiles. She wore a dress the color of a winter sky, trimmed with fur that was softer than anything Ilara had ever touched. "Look at this mess. You've made it worse. Father should have left you in the snow where he found you." Ilara gritted her teeth, biting back the tears that threatened. Crying only made them laugh harder. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the swirling pattern of spilled water and grime. "I will clean it, Lyra." Her voice was a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. It was the voice of someone who had learned that speaking any louder only invited more pain. "You will do it on your hands and knees, and you will lick it clean if I command it," Lyra said, her voice laced with venomous satisfaction. She nudged the overturned bucket with the toe of her fine leather boot. "The Supreme Alpha arrives today for the Treaty Council. This hall must be perfect. If he sees so much as a single speck of dust, I will personally see you whipped." Ilara's heart hammered against her bruised ribs. The Supreme Alpha. Kalen. His name was a legend, a story whispered by the fire to frighten pups. A warrior king, ancient and powerful, who ruled all the northern Pax with a fist of iron and shadow. They said his eyes were molten gold, that he could command the winter storms, that his howl could shatter mountains. She had never seen him. No one in her lowly position ever would. He would be in the high council chambers, surrounded by alphas and betas, not down here where the servants scrubbed and scurried. Still, the thought of such immense power being under the same roof sent a tremor of fear through her. Lyra kicked her again, a casual flick of her foot against Ilara's hip. "Get on with it, rat!" She swept away, her laughter echoing in the vast, cold emptiness of the hall. Ilara pushed herself up slowly, her body a constellation of aches. She righted the bucket, her movements stiff. She would not break. That was her secret defiance. They could bruise her skin and starve her belly, but the small, stubborn core of her refused to be extinguished. It was a tiny, flickering ember in a world of ice, but it was hers. She clung to it as she dipped the rag back into the freezing water and began to scrub again, her own reflection a wavering, worthless ghost in the stone. The tension in the fortress was a living thing. It thrummed in the very stones, a low hum of anxiety and anticipation. The arrival of the Supreme Alpha, Kalen, had changed everything. Guards in polished steel and dark wolf pelts now stood where only household sentries had been before. Their faces were grim, their eyes sharp, and they moved with the predatory grace of true warriors. Ilara kept her head down, her movements small and swift as she navigated the corridors. She was tasked with bringing warmed wine to the lower council chamber, a place she was rarely allowed to enter. The tray was heavy, the silver pitcher sweating with condensation, and her arms trembled with the effort. She could hear the voices from within, deep and resonant. The rumbling bass of her own alpha, Alaric, and another voice, one she had never heard before. It was deeper than thunder, a sound that seemed to vibrate not in the air but in her bones. It was a voice of absolute command, of ancient power. It was his. Her hand shook so violently a drop of crimson wine splashed onto the stone floor. She froze, her blood turning to ice. A mistake. Lyra's threat of a whipping echoed in her mind. She had to clean it. Now, just as she bent, the heavy oak doors to the chamber swung open with a deafening groan. A wave of palpable energy rolled out, a pressure so intense it made the air thick and hard to breathe. It smelled of pine, of winter storms, of something ancient and wild. And then she saw him. He was not a man. He was a force of nature carved into human form. Taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the light from the corridor. He was dressed in black leather and dark furs, his long, silver-streaked black hair tied back from a face that was all harsh lines and predatory beauty. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were not molten gold, they were glowing silver, like twin moons trapped in a storm-dark sky, and they were fixed on the far end of the hall, blazing with a frustration so potent it was almost a physical heat. He was arguing with Alpha Alaric, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge of menace. "Your scholars are useless, Alaric. The pact is with the old ones. The words must be spoken in their tongue, the tongue of the deep stone. None of you even remember it exists." "Supreme One," Alaric stammered, his usual blustering authority stripped away, leaving him looking small and weak. "No one has spoken the rock tongue in 1,000 years. It is lost." "Then the treaty is lost," Kalen snarled, turning his head, and his gaze, like a physical blow, landed on her. Ilara flinched, expecting a shout, an order, a dismissal. But the silver eyes narrowed. The fury within them banked, replaced by something else, a flicker of confusion? He took a step forward, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to become the invisible thing she had always been. But she was trapped, pinned by that impossible gaze. He was so close now she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He moved with a silence that defied his size. He stopped before her. He did not look at her face, not at first. His eyes were fixed on the floor, on the small, insignificant drop of spilled wine. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is this?" he asked, though the question was not directed at her. It was a demand made to the world itself. Before she could think, before the terror could completely paralyze her, a word slipped from her lips. It was not a word of her own tongue. It was a sound like grinding pebbles, like the deep groan of the earth settling. A word she had no idea she knew. Iska. It meant forgive. Forgive the stain. Forgive my clumsiness. Forgive my existence. The sound of it hung in the air, alien and ancient. Alpha Alaric gasped. The guard stiffened. But Kalen went utterly still. His head snapped up, his silver eyes locking onto hers. The confusion was gone, replaced by a shocking, breathtaking intensity. It was like staring into the heart of a star. He reached out, his hand moving with impossible speed. She tried to recoil, to pull away, but it was too late. His fingers, warm and calloused, closed around her wrist. The world exploded. It was not a sound, it was a feeling, a cataclysm of light and heat that erupted from the point of their contact. A searing, blinding pain shot up her arm, straight into her heart, as if she had been struck by lightning. She cried out, a thin, broken sound. The silver tray crashed to the floor, the pitcher shattering, wine and shards of metal scattering across the stone. But she barely noticed. All she knew was the fire that was consuming her, burning away the cold that had lived in her bones for her entire life. Through the blinding light in her vision, she saw him. He had recoiled as if struck, his own hand clenched into a fist. His eyes were no longer silver. They were blazing, molten gold, the color of a forge heart, and they were filled with a wild, incredulous awe. On the back of her wrist, where his fingers had been, a mark was forming. Lines of pure silver light were etching themselves into her skin, swirling and coalescing into a pattern that was both elegant and fierce, like a stylized wolf howling at a crescent moon. It burned. It burned with a fire that felt like it was branding her very soul. What was happening to me? The question was a silent scream in her mind. This was magic. Dark, impossible magic. Kalen took a step toward her, his expression a mask of savage wonder. He looked from her terrified face to the glowing mark on her wrist, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. It was a sound of profound, earth-shaking possession. Mine, he breathed, the word a vow, a claim, a final, unalterable judgment. Fear, raw and absolute, tore through her. This couldn't be happening. She was nothing, a nameless omega. He was the supreme alpha, a king, a legend. This was a mistake, a horrible, terrifying mistake. No, she whispered, the word barely audible. She stumbled backward, clutching her burning wrist, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond anything Lyra had ever inflicted. He saw her fear. The golden blaze in his eyes softened, just a fraction, but the intensity remained. I have been searching, he said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through her, through the very floor. For centuries. He took another step, and she took another back, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her back hit the cold stone wall of the corridor. She was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. Alpha Alaric finally found his voice. Supreme One, what is the meaning of this? She is just an Omega servant, a stray. Kalen didn't even look at him. His entire world had narrowed to the trembling girl pressed against the wall. She is not, he said, his voice flat and absolute. He raised his hand, not to touch her this time, but as if to show her something. On the back of his own hand, a faint, silvery light was beginning to glow, the ghost of a mark that mirrored her own. She is my mate. The words hung in the air, heavier than stone, more final than death. Mate. The word was a fantasy, a dream whispered by other girls, a bond of soul and spirit, a connection that made two wolves whole. It wasn't for things like her. It was for the beautiful, the strong, the worthy. It was for people like Lyra. Her mind reeled, unable to process it. Her body, however, was reacting against her will. The burning on her wrist was easing, replaced by a strange, humming warmth that spread through her veins. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but underneath it, something else was stirring. A strange, primal pull toward the immense, dangerous man standing before her. It felt like the tide being pulled by the moon, an instinct so deep and powerful it defied reason. You're her, he said again, his voice softer now, laced with a wonder that was almost reverent. The one who speaks the old tongues. The one I was promised. He reached for her again, slowly this time, giving her time to flee. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the storm of emotions warring within her, fear, disbelief, and a tiny, treacherous spark of hope that was more terrifying than anything else. His fingers brushed against her cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent another jolt through her, not of pain this time, but of pure, unadulterated energy. It was like the first warmth of spring after a long, brutal winter. Her knees gave out. The world spun into a dizzying vortex of gold and silver light, his scent of pine and storm filling her senses. As darkness claimed the edges of her vision, the last thing she heard was his voice, close to her ear, a possessive, protective growl. I have you. She woke to the scent of wood smoke and clean linen. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. She had never known a bed so soft, covers so warm and heavy. The relentless cold that had been her life's companion was gone, replaced by a deep, comforting heat that seemed to emanate from her own skin. Panic seized her as memory returned in a brutal rush. The hall, the spilled wine, the Alpha King, The burning mark. Her hand flew to her wrist. It was there, a delicate, intricate swirl of silver lines, no longer glowing, but tattooed against her pale skin as if it had always belonged there. It was real. She sat up, her heart pounding. The room was large, furnished with dark, heavy wood and rich furs. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a king's chamber, his chamber. The door opened, and he entered. Kaelin. He moved with that same unnerving silence, his presence filling the room, commanding the very air within it. He carried a small wooden tray. He stopped a few feet from the bed, his golden eyes watching her every move. The intensity was still there, but it was tempered now, banked like the coals of the fire. "You are awake." It was not a question. She pulled the furs tighter around her, her knuckles white. She couldn't find her voice. What did one say to a living legend who had just branded you as his? He seemed to understand her fear. He placed the tray on a small table. It held a bowl of steaming stew, a piece of bread, and a cup of water. Food. Real food, not the scraps she was used to. Her stomach growled, a humiliating betrayal. "Eat," he commanded. The word was soft, but it was still a command. She stared at the food, then back at him. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this? It's a mistake." A faint smile touched his lips, a startlingly gentle expression on his harsh face. "There is no mistake. I have waited 300 years for this mistake." He gestured to the mark on her wrist. "The bond does not lie. You are my mate, Elara." He knew her name. How did he know her name? The question must have shown on her face. "I can feel you," he explained, his voice a low murmur. "Your name, your fear, the ache in your ribs. It is a pale echo, but it is there. Our souls are now connected." The ache in her ribs. Lyra's kick. He could feel it. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. For the first time in her life, someone knew her pain without her having to speak it. She still couldn't bring herself to move toward the food. Hope was a dangerous poison. She had learned long ago not to taste it. This was all a dream, or a cruel game that would end with her being thrown back into the cold. "I am nothing," she said, the words torn from the deepest part of her, the truth she had been fed her whole life. "I am an omega, a servant. I am worthless." The softness vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, chilling anger. But it wasn't directed at her. "Who told you that?" he growled, the sound vibrating through the room. She flinched, pulling back. "Everyone." "They are fools," he stated, his voice absolute. "You spoke the rock tongue, a magic lost to all but the earth itself. You carry the mark of the soul bond. You are the other half of my soul. You are a queen, even if you do not know it yet." Queen. The word was so absurd, so far from her reality, that a hysterical laugh almost escaped her. She choked it back. He was mad. That had to be it. The great supreme alpha was mad, and she was caught in his delusion. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Just let me go. I'll go back to the kitchens. I won't say a word. No one has to know." "No," he said, and the single word was as unyielding as the stone of the fortress. He came closer, sitting on the edge of the massive bed. He did not touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. The heat from his body was like a furnace. "Your life of scrubbing floors and taking beatings is over. Your life is with me now." His gaze dropped to her wrist again, and a look of profound tenderness crossed his features. "This mark," he said softly. "It is a promise. I will protect you. I will cherish you. I will burn the world to the ground for you." The sincerity in his voice was a physical blow. It bypassed all her defenses, all the walls she had built around her heart. No one had ever spoken to her with such reverence. No one had ever promised her anything but more pain. Tears she had refused to shed for Lyra now welled in her eyes, hot and thick. They spilled over, tracing cold paths down her cheeks. She felt a flicker of the old shame, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the tidal wave of his presence, his impossible promises. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a shiver of warmth through her. "There is nothing to fear from me, little one." But she was afraid. She was afraid of the hope he was offering her, afraid of the power simmering in his eyes, afraid of the strange, insistent pull in her own soul that told her he was speaking the truth. To believe him was to turn her entire world upside down. To believe him meant she was not worthless, and that was the most terrifying thought of all. Unseen, in the shadows of the grand hall, Lyra had watched it all. She had seen the supreme alpha, the mighty Kaelin, touch the filthy Omega. She had seen the flash of light, the impossible mark blooming on the worthless girl's skin, and she had seen the look on Kaelin's face, a look of reverence, of possession, of awe. Rage, bitter and corrosive as acid, churned in her gut. That should have been her. She was the Beta's daughter, beautiful and strong. She was the one who deserved the power, the status, the honor of being the supreme alpha's mate. Not that sniveling, pathetic rat. The mark. It was a key, a source of power. Kaelin had claimed the girl, but the bond was new, fragile. Lyra's mind, sharp and cruel, began to work. If Kaelin wanted the girl, then others might want her too. Others who opposed the supreme alpha. She slipped away from the hall, her movements silent and purposeful. She knew the whispers, the rumors of a shadowy faction that sought to undermine Kaelin's rule. The Ember Covenant. They were said to deal in dark magic, led by a rival king who called himself Morvath, the Shadow of the Mountain. Her father had forbidden any contact with them, calling them heretics and traitors, but her father was a fool, content with his position. Lyra wanted more. She wanted everything. She found one of Alaric's scribes in a dusty, forgotten library, a man known for his greed and loose loyalties. A few silver coins and a whispered promise of favor were all it took. A message was sent, carried by a raven with feathers the color of ash. It was a simple message, but it held the weight of a kingdom. The Supreme Alpha has found his fated mate, an unmarked Omega with the gift of the old tongues. The bond is new. She is his weakness. Lyra smiled as the raven took flight, a black speck against the gray sky. She had planted a seed of chaos. Kaelin might think he had found his queen, but she would ensure Ilara's reign was short-lived. The worthless orphan would be a bargaining chip, a tool to bring down the king. And in the ensuing chaos, Lyra would rise. She would claim the power that was rightfully hers. The next few days passed in a strange, dreamlike haze for Ilara. She remained in Kaelin's chambers, a gilded cage she was too afraid to leave. He brought her food himself, sat with her while she ate, speaking to her in his low, rumbling voice. He told her stories of the old world, of the magic that flowed in the earth and the sky. He explained the soul bond, how it was a connection that transcended flesh, a destiny woven by the ancient powers. She listened, a part of her still convinced this was an elaborate fantasy. But the warmth in her veins was real. The mark on her wrist was real, and the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, felt terrifyingly real. He was patient, so patient. He never pushed, never demanded anything of her. He simply existed in her space, a powerful, protective presence that was slowly, inexorably, breaking down her walls. A desperate, fragile hope began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. Maybe Maybe this was real. Maybe she wasn't worthless. "I have to leave for a few hours," he told her on the third day. The frustration was back in his golden eyes. Alaric and his counselor demanding an explanation. They do not understand. Fear, cold and familiar, pricked at her. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice small. The thought of being alone, even in this luxurious room, was unsettling. His presence had become a shield. He came to her, cupping her face in his large, warm hands. "Only to the council chambers. My guards will be outside the door. No one will harm you. I swear it on my soul." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "Hold on to the bond. You can feel me, even when I am not here." He was right. She could feel him. A steady, warm presence at the edge of her consciousness. A hum of power and affection that was a constant reassurance. She nodded, trying to be brave. He left, and the room suddenly felt colder, emptier. She wrapped a fur blanket around her shoulders and sat by the fire, tracing the silver mark on her wrist. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly imagine it. A life without cold, without hunger, without kicks and curses. A life where she was cherished. A soft scratching sound came from the balcony door. Ilara froze. Kaylin's guards were at the main door. The balcony overlooked a sheer drop of hundreds of feet. No one could be there. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. A shadow fell across the stone floor. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The glass shattered inward, not with a loud crash, but with a silent, implosive pop. Men dressed in black, their faces obscured by shadow and dark magic, swarmed into the room. They moved without a sound, like wraiths. There were no shouts, no alarms. It was as if they had stepped out of the darkness itself. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth, rough and cold. A cloth was pressed to her face, smelling of bitter herbs and something metallic. Her head swam, the room tilting violently. Panic surged, and she reached out, not with her hands but with her mind, desperately clawing for the connection to Kaylin. She felt him, a distant warmth, and she pushed all of her terror, all of her desperation, into the bond. "Kaylin!" And then the world went black. The pain was the first thing to register, a deep, gnawing ache that felt like a part of her had been carved out, leaving a hollow, freezing void. It was the bond. It was stretched thin, screaming with distance and distress. Kaylin was a faint, faraway flicker, a dying star in an endless night. She was lying on cold, damp stone. The air was thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. Chains, heavy and cold, bound her wrists and ankles. She opened her eyes to near-total darkness, relieved only by the faint, sickly green glow of phosphorescent moss clinging to the walls. She was in a dungeon, a cave, someplace deep beneath the earth. "She is awake." The voice was smooth, cultured, but held an undertone of chilling cruelty. A figure stepped out of the shadows. He was tall and slender, dressed in robes the color of dried blood, embroidered with silver thread. His face was pale and aristocratic, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, but his eyes were pits of absolute darkness. They seemed to drink the light from the room. "Welcome, little linchpin," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am Morvath, the Shadow King, the leader of the Ember Covenant." Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the fog in her mind. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What do you want?" "You are in my sanctuary," Morvath said, circling her slowly, like a wolf studying its prey. "And what I want is everything Kaylin has. His kingdom, his power. And you, my dear, are the key." He crouched down in front of her, his dark eyes boring into hers. You see, for centuries, Kalen's power has been absolute because he stood alone. No weakness, no attachments. But then he found you. Morvath reached out, his long, pale fingers tracing the silver mark on her wrist. The touch was vile, a desecration. It felt like ice and decay, and the mark itself seemed to recoil, the skin around it stinging. "This bond," he murmured, his voice filled with a hungry fascination. "And the power you hold, the ability to speak the old tongues. With you, I can command the very elements Kalen claims dominion over. I can turn the heart of his kingdom against him." Her blood ran cold. He didn't just want to use her as a hostage. He wanted to twist her power, to use her soul as a weapon against the one person who had ever shown her kindness. "No," she said, finding a sliver of defiance. "I won't help you." Morvath laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You misunderstand. You will not have a choice." He gestured to the chains on her wrists. "Silver, a wonderful metal. It dampens most magic. It weakens the bond. Soon, you will be so disconnected from him, so lost in the pain and the dark, that you will welcome any voice that offers you release. And that voice will be mine." The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing the fragile hope that had just begun to grow. He was right. The connection to Kalen was fading, the comforting warmth being replaced by an agonizing, soul-deep cold. She was alone again. Worse than alone. She was a weapon to be used against her mate. The label she had worn her whole life echoed in her mind. Worthless. She wasn't just worthless anymore. She was dangerous. Her very existence was a threat to him. Tears of despair tracked paths through the grime on her face. She closed her eyes, trying to find that flicker of Kalen's presence, to hold on to it. It was so faint, so far away. "Hold on." The voice was not in the room. It was in her head, a faint whisper across the screaming void of the damaged bond. It was his voice. Her eyes snapped open. "Elara, hold on. I am coming." It was weak, strained with effort and his own pain, but it was there, a single thread of light in the suffocating darkness. He was fighting for her. He was looking for her. Morvath, seeing the shift in her expression, frowned. "What is it?" She said nothing. She closed her eyes again, focusing all of her will, all of her being on that single thread. She poured her own desperate plea into it. "Hurry." He had felt it. The moment she was taken, the bond had shrieked in his soul, a chord of pure agony and terror that had nearly brought him to his knees in the middle of the council chamber. He had thrown the table aside, his roar of fury shaking the fortress to its foundations. She was gone. The rage was a living thing, a white-hot inferno that threatened to consume him. His warriors, his elite guard, mobilized in an instant, their own fury a reflection of their alphas. He found the shattered balcony door, the scent of dark magic and the faint, terrified trace of his mate. The trail was cold, masked by powerful sorcery, but it could not hide from the bond. He could feel her, a distant point of light and pain to the east, deep under the mountains. The Ember Covenant, Morvath. For 3 days, he and his warriors had torn across the frozen landscape. They moved like a storm, a force of nature driven by a single, desperate purpose. The pain of the severed bond was a constant torment, a hollow ache in his chest that fueled his rage. He could feel her despair, her fear, and it was a knife twisting in his gut. He pushed them harder, his wolf clawing at the surface, desperate to be unleashed. He reached out to her with his mind, pouring all his strength, all his will, into the damaged connection. "Hold on. I am coming." Her faint reply, "Hurry," was a whisper of hope that sharpened his rage into a deadly, focused point. They found the entrance to Morvath's fortress hidden behind a frozen waterfall, masked by illusions. There was no subtlety, no stealth. Kalen, his eyes blazing gold, slammed his fists into the rock face. The mountain groaned, and the stone shattered, exploding inward. He was the first one through the breach, his greatsword a blur of silver and death. Morvath's shadow-clad soldiers swarmed them, but they were no match for the fury of a mated alpha. He cut through them, a whirlwind of destruction, his every move driven by one thought: Ilara. The battle raged, a cacophony of steel on steel, of snarls and screams. He followed the pull of the bond, deeper and deeper into the dark, twisting fortress, his warriors carving a path behind him. He found her in the lowest dungeon. She was chained to the wall, pale and still, her light so dim he feared for a moment he was too late. Morvath stood over her, a ritual knife in his hand, its blade glowing with dark energy. "You are too late, Kalen," Morvath hissed, a triumphant sneer on his face. "With her power, I will sever this bond and claim her for myself. The earth will obey me." "You will touch her again," Kalen snarled, his voice a low promise of death. "And I will unmake you." He launched himself across the room, but Morvath was prepared. He chanted a word of power, and shadows rose from the floor, coalescing into monstrous forms, their claws like shards of obsidian. They threw themselves at Kalen, slowing him, their dark magic sapping his strength. Ilara watched through a haze of pain and weakness. She saw Kalen fighting for her, a magnificent, terrible force of righteous fury. She saw the shadow creatures clawing at him, their dark magic leaving smoking wounds on his arms and shoulders. He grunted in pain, stumbling for a moment. He was hurt. Because of her. They were hurting him to get to her. Something inside her snapped. The small, stubborn ember of defiance she had nurtured her whole life roared into a conflagration. The self-doubt, the fear, the years of being told she was worthless, it all burned away in a sudden, volcanic surge of protective rage. He was hers, and they would not touch him. A scream tore from her throat, but it was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of pure, untamed power. It was a word in a language no one had spoken for millennia, the language of life itself. Light, brilliant and pure as a newborn star, exploded from her. It was not a gentle light. It was a concussive, cleansing fire. The silver chains binding her wrists melted into slag. The shadow creatures dissolved into smoke and echoes, their darkness unable to exist in the face of such absolute purity. She rose to her feet, her body trembling not with weakness, but with a power so immense it threatened to tear her apart. The air crackled around her, the very stones of the dungeon hummed, responding to her call. Her eyes, once the color of a timid forest floor, were now glowing with the same silver light as her mark. Morvath stared, his handsome face twisted in a mask of shock and fear. What are you?" Ilara looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she did not see a superior. She saw something small and foul that had dared to harm her mate. "I am his," she said, and her voice was no longer a whisper. It was the voice of the mountain, of the deep earth, resonant and unyielding. "And you are nothing." She raised her hand, and the stone floor beneath Morvath's feet erupted. A spike of granite, sharp as a spear, shot upward. He cried out, throwing himself aside at the last second, but a second and third spike followed, penning him in, tearing his robes. Kalen watched, his pain forgotten, his heart swelling with a fierce, possessive pride. This was his mate, his queen. Not a timid servant, but a force of creation and destruction. Morvath, cornered and desperate, lunged at her with his ritual knife. If I cannot have you, no one will." Ilara didn't flinch. She simply held up her hand, and a shield of shimmering, solid light appeared before her, stopping the blade inches from her face. The dark magic of the knife hissed and evaporated against the purity of her power. She closed her fist. The granite spikes around Morvath slammed together, crushing him. His scream was cut short, and then there was only silence, broken by the drip of water and the panting of her own breath. The light receded, the immense power sinking back beneath her skin, leaving her trembling and utterly exhausted. The silver glow faded from her eyes. She swayed on her feet, the world spinning. Before she could fall, strong arms were around her. Kaelin. He held her tight against his chest, his face buried in her hair. He was murmuring her name, over and over, like a prayer. "Ilara, my Ilara, you are safe. I have you." She clung to him, her strength gone, tears of relief and exhaustion streaming down her face. The cold, empty void inside her was gone, filled to overflowing with his warmth, his presence. The bond flared between them, stronger than ever, a searing, brilliant connection that healed the wounds on his skin and soothed the terror in her soul. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Let's go home," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. She rested her head against his shoulder, her hand coming to rest over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat. Home. The word had never meant anything to her before. Now, it meant everything. The journey back was a blur of warmth and security. Kaelin never let her go, carrying her the entire way, his warriors forming a protective circle around them. When they finally reached his fortress, he did not take her back to his chambers. He carried her straight to the throne room. The great hall was filled with the alphas and betas of the northern packs, Alaric and a pale, terrified-looking Lyra among them. They had been gathered, waiting for news. They all fell silent as Kaelin strode in, Ilara held securely in his arms. He did not place her on the ground. Instead, he walked to the massive, carved stone throne at the head of the room and sat down, settling her gently on his lap, his arm a possessive, unyielding band around her waist. He was presenting them as a unit, a single entity of power. He looked out over the assembled wolves, his golden eyes blazing with an authority that left no room for argument. "This is Ilara," he announced, his voice echoing in the sudden, absolute silence. "The one who speaks the tongue of the earth, the one who shattered the shadow of the mountain." A collective gasp went through the room. Murmurs of disbelief and awe rippled through the crowd. "She is my mate," Kaelin continued, his voice dropping to a possessive growl that every wolf in the room understood on a primal level. "And she is your queen." He looked down at her then, his gaze softening, filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. "Is that all right with you?" he murmured, for her ears only. She looked from his beloved face out to the sea of powerful wolves staring at her. She saw Lyra, her face a mask of bitter defeat and shock. She saw Alaric, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. They were not looking at a worthless Omega anymore. They were looking at the woman who sat on the Supreme Alpha's throne, cradled in his arms. The self-doubt, the ingrained feeling of worthlessness was not entirely gone. It was a scar, a faint echo of a lifetime of pain. But it no longer had power over her. It was a memory, not a reality. She met Kaelin's gaze, and a real smile, the first of her life, bloomed on her face. She raised her hand, the one with the silver mark, and gently touched his cheek. The bond pulsed between them, a silent language of love, acceptance, and belonging. In a voice that was clear and strong, a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, she gave her answer. "Yes,